Jesus was an Aramaic-speaking Jew of the Middle East, and the Assyrians are Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Middle East who have endured persecution for over 1,000 years. Join Voice of the Word Aramaic Bible teacher, artist, and author Stephen Missick as he examines the Bible through the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times in which it was first revealed. Research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots. And now, Voice of the Word.
Hello, I'm Stephen Andrew Missick, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Aramaic School of the Bible. This is episode number 4, Resources for Studying the Semitic Roots of Christianity. There used to be very few Bible translations or commentaries that focused on Semitic or the Jewish roots. There was Hugh Schofield's The Original New Testament, and David Stern did the Jewish New Testament. Now there are a plethora of Hebrew roots, New Testaments, and Sacred Name Bibles. A lot of these translations trying to do a Jewish perspective. But we have the Syriac Peshitta version of the Bible in Aramaic, a very ancient version. And what I'm going to look at in this program is how to study the Bible from the New Testament, particularly from an Aramaic perspective. This is also a way to get out of the Eurocentric Christendom mindset. I think it's very interesting that one of the things that these Bibles do to try to reconnect with the Semitic roots is they'll use the form Yeshua, Jesus' name in Aramaic, in like the Jewish New Testament and Bibles like that. But one of our earliest Bible translation New Testaments of the Syriac was John Wesley Etheridge, and he used Yeshu for the name of Jesus. Very interesting version. This is in the later part of the 1800s. This translation was made, and it's a translation from the Aramaic Syriac Peshitta New Testament. So he used a lot of Aramaic forms of words in it, and I think it's very helpful to get a reconnection with the Aramaic. So he's trying to let the reader get as much an encounter to the original Aramaic text as possible through his translation of the Syriac Peshitta New Testament into English. Around the same time, James Murdoch also translated the Syriac Peshitta into English, but he used standard English names. It's an accurate translation of the Syriac Peshitta. Both of these are good translations from the 1800s. Then George Lamza, an Assyrian American, arrived on the scene. He immigrated over here, I believe, before the lines in the Middle East were drawn. He came from a place where many Assyrian Christians came from. The Hakkari Mountains, I believe, is where he came from, which is in Turkey now. It was an important Assyrian Christian homeland, and the Turks did ethnic cleansing and forced a lot of these people into Turkey and Iran. But George Lamza made his way to the United States. And the interesting thing about George Lamza is he translated the Bible from Syriac into English, from Aramaic into English. Syriac is a form of Aramaic. It's very close to the Aramaic that Jesus spoke. But George Lamza would say that he had a unique perspective that Americans really didn't have on the Bible, because he grew up in Bible lands. He grew up in a pre-industrial society where people lived like they did in Bible times, and he grew up speaking the language of Jesus. I guess there's some truth to that. He still had shepherds, no electricity, people living in villages drawing water from the wells. So he actually did grow up in a way of life that many people in Old Testament and New Testament times, biblical times, did. However, you got to bear in mind that things had changed. The modern world did encroach to a certain extent, and it's not exactly the same thing when you're 2,000 years behind. Now, I'll grant that does give him an experience that and a unique perspective that most Americans don't have. But he also claimed that just in virtue of being a native Aramaic speaker, that gave him a greater understanding of the Scriptures. Perhaps, but I mean, if you go to Israel, you go to Greece, people speak Greek. Now, The thing is, Greek has changed over the centuries. Hebrew has changed over the centuries. And Aramaic has changed over the centuries. It is the language of Jesus or the language of David or the language of the New Testament, but it's evolved with the passing of time. So it's not the exact same. And I would say it's like, just because I grew up speaking English doesn't make me an expert on Shakespeare. Now, if I grew up in England, maybe where Shakespeare came from, maybe they give me a little more insight into Shakespeare. But the fact of the matter is, our time, even if I grew up in Stratford-on-Avon, I think that's where I've been there, where Shakespeare was from. I love Shakespeare. And I went to his tomb, and I wanted to go to the Globe Theater when I was in England, and I didn't. And I realized I was like right there. It's kind of funny. Right after the war, I came back from the war, and my seminary, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, had this Oxford study tour. I wanted to do it, and I didn't prepare. I just had to go from the war to stay at Oxford. And if I was able to prepare a little bit better, I would have gone to the Globe and just been there. It'd be pretty cool. But the fact of the matter is, just say I've read some of Shakespeare, and perhaps being a native English speaker, perhaps if I was from Stratford-on-Avon, I would have a little more perspective. But the fact of the matter is, to become a good Bible scholar, you have to study the Scriptures. And I strongly believe that we now know more about the Bible than anybody since John wrote the last verse of the book of Revelations, because of archaeology and linguistic studies. From then till now, there's a lot of discoveries that people just didn't know. So now the understanding of the Bible is just so vast. So I'll give Lamsa some credit, but it's not as, just because he grew up speaking Aramaic and grew up in Bible lands. He didn't grow up in the Holy Land. He grew up in what's southern Turkey today. So yeah, he does have some insight, but I wouldn't say it's as profound as he's trying to make it out to be. But Mr. Lamsa wrote a lot of commentaries on the Scriptures, and he was a great popularizer of Aramaic. I'll give him that. But I don't know if I agree with all of his conclusions. And he associated with people of questionable theology. To me, certain essential doctrines are very important. The doctrine of Trinity, virgin birth, things that traditional Christians have believed. He got a lot of support from the Unity Church of Christianity and like Unitarian Universalist type churches. I just have a little bit of problems with that. So anyway, Lamsa's writings aren't up to date now anyway, even if his theological perspective was better. He was writing for a general Christian audience, so I don't think that he was really promoting universalism too much. But in his writings, one thing I've noticed reading them is he's taken a rationalist approach to Scripture, trying to play down the miraculous elements of it, like saying Jesus fed 5,000. Well, maybe people were being selfish and they had the food and they weren't sharing. So when he's feeding 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes, they felt convicted and they started sharing. He's trying to come up with a logical explanation of it instead of what the Bible says. This is a miracle. Jesus is the Son of God and he can do miracles. People like to come up with rational explanations, and that might have been the mode in the early part of the mid-20th century when Lamsa was writing his books. But I just think that sometimes, I'm a very rationalist, very skeptical person, and I like to see evidence. But Jesus is God incarnate, and he can do miracles. So that's George Lamsa. Now, there are people who are kind of they're going beyond what George Lamsa did. Like this guy named Neil Douglas Klutz. He's like translating the Lord's Prayer. I mean, this guy's gone all the way from Lamsa was. I think he's supported by the Unitarians, but he is writing for a wider audience. And now Neil Douglas Klutz is taking the Aramaic to the New Age movement. I think they're trying to change the New Age, what's called the New Age movement is called now, to like Ancient Mysteries or something like that. If you go to a bookstore, used to have the New Age section, and they've changed it because people who belong to that movement, I guess they feel like they're trying to move away from that, because I think people looked on the New Age movement as kind of ridiculous, irrational. So they're trying to repackage, represent themselves. But Neil Douglas Klutz, he's translating the Lord's Prayer, Awun Dwashmeya Nithkadash Shma Tete Malkutha. But he's translating it as Our Father and Mother of the Cosmos. Like, our Father is the Father and Mother, instead of in heaven, it's of the cosmos. So it's very New Age mystical translation. And I don't think that that's a warranted translation from the Aramaic, personally. And I think there are a few scholars who would believe that was. Perhaps, I don't know if Lamsa died in the 70s, so who knows, probably think 1976. But he was supported by those type of peoples on the fringes of Christianity, and that's where Neil Douglas Klutz is finding his audience. So I don't think, well, the fact of the matter is Neil Douglas Klutz is going beyond what George Lamsa did. Not, I doubt Lamsa would approve of that. Who maybe would have, but I kind of doubt it. The important thing is one of the things that Lamsa said in one of his writings is like, this is my Bible is the first translation from the Aramaic. You people have been reading Bibles from the Greek. I'm going back to the Aramaic. Well, that's not true, because in the late 1800s there were other translations. So to me, I'm not anti-Lamsa. I appreciate what he did for Aramaic, but I think that the Murdoch and the Etheridge translation are probably a lot more accurate than Lamsa's version, and we need a new Aramaic translation. I think there are others out there. I need to do some more research on that area, and I'll mention some of the ones we have out there now. The Way International, I think Lamsa went and visited with these people, and they produced a translation of the Syriac Peshitta into English, and an interlinear Bible and a concordance. It's actually a very well done, but the Way International is a cult. They also deny the Divine Trinity. There's a man called Victor Paul Wierwille, and he founded the Way International. And he went to a reputable evangelical Bible Institute, Moody Bible Institute, but he started taking cultic teachings from the Seventh-day Adventist and the Jehovah's Witnesses cults. Seventh-day Adventist is a little more mainstream than Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're both from the same origin, from the Millerite movement, split into the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you do research in these two groups, you'll see there's a lot of similarities, just because they have a shared origin in the Millerite movements of the 1840s. But Victor Paul Wierwille started taking some false doctrines from the Jehovah's Witnesses and repackaging them, and he started this organization called the Way International. And Lamsa went and taught them about Aramaic. I guess I would teach anybody that wants to listen to what I have to say, but I'm not going to condone false doctrines. If somebody asks me what I believe, I'm going to be honest. But he visited with Way International. But the thing is, Unitarian Universalists that Lamsa is associated with, they also deny the Trinity, as does the Way International. And the Syrian Church of the East, the Aramaic churches, affirm the doctrine of the Trinity, and that Jesus, that Yeshua, is fully God and fully man. So let's look at these successors of Lamsa. You have Victor Paul Wierwille was somebody that was associated with Lamsa in a limited manner, and he made this interlinear Bible, which is very nice. I got a copy of it. I need to get a better edition. I had to photocopy it by hand. It's hard to get the Way International Syriac interlinear Bible nowadays. There's another person named Andrew Gabriel Roth. He's a Jewish believer in Jesus and a Peshitta primacist. That means he believes the Peshitta is the actual New Testament written by the apostles and used by the early church. Now, it's very ancient. I respect the Peshitta, but we don't have the original Aramaic versions of the Bible. Most of the New Testament was written in Greek. It's just a fact. Rome is mostly Greek-speaking, actually, even though it's the center of Latin culture. there's a lot of Greek. So Paul writes an epistle in Greek to Rome, and First and Second Corinthians. Where's Corinth at? It's between Athens and Sparta. So Paul's writing these churches. It's just not feasible that he would be writing in Aramaic to these communities. He's writing in Greek. Paul grew up in Tarsus, which is a bilingual city where he grew up speaking both Aramaic and Greek. So I can't believe, I'm not going to teach that the Peshitta, I believe it's important, very important study tool. We should use it, but it's not the original text. It's a translation of the Bible back into Jesus' language. I met Andrew Gabriel Roth. He gave a pretty good presentation. A lot of his teachings were interesting. He was talking about the Gospel of John and how things make a lot more sense in the Aramaic than they do in Greek. He had some good insights, but I still, perhaps by going back into Aramaic, they're able to reconstruct original readings. But I can't believe that the Peshitta is the original Aramaic Bible, because it has some Greek words and influences in it. You can tell it's a translation. It's important. I'm not knocking it, but I'm not going to say it is what it isn't. Andrew Gabriel Roth, he also wrote an extensive commentary in his Bible. He's got an edition printed in the Syriac Estrangolo script, the ancient script, and he did one in the Syriac script in the modern Hebrew, square Aramaic alphabet. I got a copy of it, and maybe it's got some good material in it, but I need to do some more research on Andrew Gabriel Roth. He is a Messianic Jewish believer, but there's good Messianics, there's bad Messianics, and or there's kind of iffy Messianics. Doctrine and theology is important, and I have to do some more research into Andrew Gabriel Roth. I don't want to promote something that has theological error in it. I don't know if Andrew Gabriel Roth has theological error. I didn't notice any when I went to his teaching here in Houston, but I need to research that. So if you're rooted in theology and you understand theology well, maybe you could use Andrew Gabriel Roth's book, but if not, I don't want to lead people astray, so I'll be careful. Jan Megaria, I met her as well. She's produced a translation of Syriac Peshitta. It's sort of like what the Way International did. She has a translation, she has an interlinear Bible and a concordance. It's very helpful. I met her. She's a very nice person. She also has a Messianic version translated from the Aramaic. So it's nice set. I think she's a former Way International, but I couldn't find any fault with her Bible translation and interlinear Bible. There's a man named David Boschner, and he's also produced an Aramaic interlinear Bible, which I haven't purchased yet, and so it's out there. Now, this is something that kind of bothers me. Gorgias Press puts out a lot of good Aramaic publications, and they're doing a translation of the Syriac Peshitta called the Antioch Bible. And I guess it takes a lot of work. You have to finance it, but they're publishing each book of the New Testament in an individual version. I'm sure they're going to probably put 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Jude in one book, and probably two epistles of Peter in one book. So sometimes they'll put different books in one volume, but it's like $100. So you're looking at just a rough estimate, $2,700 for a Aramaic Bible. He also uses they use the Surto script, the old Jacobite script, which I have trouble reading. It's my fault I haven't studied it. I think it's a very ugly script too. I use the Strangolo alphabet, which both the Syrian Orthodox and the Church of the East use the Strangolo. That's probably the best alphabet to learn if you're going to study Aramaic, but I think the Eastern font is easier to read, it's more aesthetically pleasing, and the verb system is easier to use than Surto. Surto looks like Arabic. Surto is the Syrian Orthodox form of the writing. But if you're going to study this seriously, I don't know why, but the Jacobite script is more dominant for now. I think people are starting to move towards the Estrangolo script more. But a lot of times if you get a Bible published or a theological book published in Syriac, often it's in the Jacobite script. But I've been seeing a lot of movements towards the Strangulo, which is probably best because the Strangulo is a neutral alphabet. Because if you use the Eastern font or if you use the Western font, you're preferring one denomination of the Syriac tradition over the other. But if you use the Strangulo font, they both use it. So it's probably the best way to go. All right. Let's look at some more points here. I gotta readjust my notes I'm reading. All right. Let's talk about Aramaic Bible scholarship. I need to rewrite my Aramaic resource guide, but I want to talk about some Aramaic scholars. Probably my favorite is Joachim Jeremias. Joachim Jeremias was a German theologian who grew up in the Holy Land. He's Lutheran. He's very interested in the Jewish culture and background life of Jesus and the Aramaic language of Jesus. Gustav Dahlmann was another Aramaic scholar who was Jeremias' mentor. We have people, as I mentioned before, who use the Targums to understand the cultural background of Jesus. Bruce Chilton, Martin McNamara, and John Ronning are people who have done that. Maurice Casey passed away a couple of years ago, and he used Aramaic from the time of Jesus to reconstruct parts of the Bible, the New Testament, in Aramaic, which were originally written. He wrote 2 books. I mentioned this before, Aramaic Sources of Mark's Gospel and an Aramaic Approach to Q. Those are good books. However, Maurice Casey also wrote a book attacking the reliability of the Gospel of John. So I don't agree with all of his conclusions. However, his scholarship is solid. And when you do serious Bible research, there's good conservative Bible scholars, and there are actually some good moderate and liberal Bible scholars, and you have to be sure of your faith, because there's some people like, what's his name? Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman I think he's a big fraud. I've read some of his books, but all he does, he claims to be a great Bible scholar, all he does is write book after book after book attacking the historical reliability of the Bible and what Christians believe. So he's basically a anti-Christian polemicist. He writes very well, and he's has a theological education, and he knows how to do research techniques, but he has an agenda. You have to be aware of that, and I think a lot of his conclusions and his scholarship is now suspect. For instance, one thing I've done some, very interested in is the oral culture. Jesus is born and operated in an oral culture. People could read, but not everybody. And when Jesus is doing the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't say, "You have read, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy. You have heard it said," and he goes on. The reason why he says you have heard it said is because most of these people couldn't read or write. You probably had over 60% illiteracy. Now, people could, and so when Jesus is talking to certain people, he'd say, "Haven't you read the scriptures? Haven't you read where it says this or that?" So when Jesus is speaking to the masses, he's speaking to mostly illiterate people who are subsistence farmers. But there were the intelligentsia who was literate. So what Bart Ehrman did in a recent book was he was talking about oral cultures, and I think it's pretty obvious is that it's hard to have accurate information passed down by word of mouth century after century after century. And he's saying, well, in the early church era, people are telling stories of Jesus orally. And that's true, but we have an epistle by Paul, who, Paul's writing to churches, and he knew Peter, he knew James, the brother of Jesus. So then we have the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, containing material written by the apostles. So yes, there's some truth about the oral cultures and the gospel being proclaimed in an oral society, but the New Testament is written while many of these people are still alive, so there's not enough time for legend and mythic development, especially when you had Peter would go and travel. Paul went, and it looks based on historical sources. Peter traveled to Antioch. We know that because that's mentioned in the Bible. But apparently Peter did make it to Rome. So, like Paul, when he's writing Corinth, is people are saying, "I am of Paul. I am of Apollos. I am of Kepha. I am of Peter." So you have a lot of first. You don't just have oral tradition being passed down over the centuries. You have direct contact with eyewitnesses. So Bart Ehrman is trying to find whatever way. He's just full of hate, and he's just trying to attack God, fight against God for whatever reason. It's unfortunate, but you have to be careful when you're doing research. When you get that in depth, you just need to be careful and know what you believe. All right, let's look at Aramaic commentaries on the Scriptures. And I got my book I wrote here. This is Christ's Language, Spiritual Insight to the Aramaic, and we're going to look at some things in there. I want to look at some of my notes first. Ephraim the Syrian made a commentary in the Diatessaron of Tatian the Assyrian, which has survived. I have a copy of it. I read some of it. There's a series of books called Ancient Christian Commentary on Scriptures. It's a multi-volume commentary on the Bible. It focuses on scriptural commentary from the early church period. It does contain some commentary by the Syriac church fathers, but it's not its exclusive focus. So I look through it because that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see somebody do a study Bible incorporating Syriac church fathers and their commentary. And it does have some of it, but most of the commentaries that it's in the ancient commentary of Scriptures are from the Greek and Latin church fathers, with some Syriac sprinkled in there. So I was a little bit disappointed with it. There are Syriac books that are like retellings of the Bible, such as the Cave of Treasures and the Book of the Bee. It's very fascinating. The Book of the Bee is a collection of theological and historical texts compiled by Solomon of Aklat in the 13th century. The book contains 55 chapters discussing various topics from the creation, heaven and earth, the angels, paradise, the Old Testament patriarchs, New Testament events, list of kings and patriarchs, and the final day of resurrection. Cave of Treasures is a similar book where it starts with it's like a cave in the Garden of Eden, or a cave that Adam and Eve fled to after expelled from the garden, and it tells the Bible story from Adam and Eve until past the time of Solomon, I believe. So it's interesting where you get the Syriac Christian perspective on the Scriptures. We need a accurate translation of the Aramaic into modern English that people can afford. And it'd be good to have commentary that reflects current scholarship on the Scriptures, and also a commentary from the ancient fathers. So we don't have those things yet. See, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the field of Aramaic, and I believe that this work will be done. Now, in my book, Christ's Language, I have a chapter called The Aramaic Church Fathers, and I want to look at some of these people. I mentioned Tatian the Assyrian. He studied under the famous philosopher St. Justin Martyr. Tatian, after St. Justin Martyr was martyred, Tatian returned to his homeland probably around 172 AD. He wrote Oration Against the Greeks and compiled the Diatessaron of Tatian, Harmony of the Gospels. There's also Bardason, the Aramaic philosopher. We have his writings, and we have Afrahat, the Persian sage, and then Ephraim the Syrian. Bardason was 154 to 222. Afrahat is 337 to 345. Ephraim the Syrian lived around the year 306 until 373. He's considered a doctor of the church by the Roman Catholic Church. So he's important. He wrote a lot of hymns and commentaries on the Scriptures. I think he believed in the perpetual virginity of the Virgin Mary, so he honored the Virgin Mary. Of course, some Protestants, of course, aren't going to agree with some of Ephraim's teachings. Fortunately, after this time, there's a schism in the Church of the East, and certain people in the Church of the East followed the teachings of Nestorius, who taught that Jesus was fully God and fully man and had two natures. And then there's the teachings of Cyril of Alexandria. Cyril of Alexandria is a rabid anti-Semite. He would send bandits out, thugs, to kill his adversaries, organized pogroms against the Jews. He had a pagan philosopher named Hypatia murdered and skinned alive. So he's a very unsavory character, but he was able to win out against Nestorius and accuse Nestorius of heresy for teaching that Jesus has two natures, a full divine and human nature. So once this was done by Cyril of Alexandria, the church was divided between people influenced by Cyril's teachings and the Nestorians, who were kind of forced off to the east, where they became very influential in the Assyrian Church of the East. There's in the Church of the East, you had a church father named Heba, or Ebus. He wrote from 435 to 457. Bar Suma was another important church leader. And you have Narsai, the harp of the Holy Spirit. He died around the year 503. They had seminaries and universities in the East. St. Isaac of Nineveh was a great mystical teacher. He lived around the year 700 AD. He's universally recognized as a saint by the Russian, Greek, Syrian, and Egyptian Christians, oddly enough. Even though he was a member of the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorian Church, these other churches recognize him as a great spiritual father. Babai the Great developed a systematic theology, 551. You have Abraham of Kashgar, who led a renewal movement in the monasteries. Thomas of Marga, he wrote the Book of Governors, which is an important history of monasticism in the Church of the East. Timothy the Great, he defended the truth of Christianity against the Muslim caliph. His account of arguing the truth of Christianity against the Muslims has survived. So Timothy the Great was a great Bible scholar. There's an Assyrian Christian named Adam Ching, who translated and wrote works for Christians in China. Who else do we have? We have Mar Abdishu. He wrote a book called The Pearl. The Pearl is a summation of the basic doctrine taught by the Church of the East. Now, let's look at the Jacobite sect, or the Syrian Orthodox. You have Jacob Bardius, and he was really the founder of the Syrian Orthodox Church for all intents and purposes. He would go around and ordain bishops. You have this big controversy about the natures of Christ, and the Syrian Orthodox Church used to be called Monophysites because they taught that Jesus had one nature, his divine nature. But nowadays they call themselves the Henophysites, and while they focus on the divine nature, they claim now that they do believe Jesus also had a human nature. But that's not how their views have been understood throughout history. All these churches are affirming that Jesus is fully God and fully man. They're just disagreeing about how that exactly works. Rabula, he lived in 435. I don't know if he's somebody, I think it might have been him, but you had the Syriac Christians used the diatessaron of Tatian the Assyrian. They wouldn't use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but he or somebody else affirmed a movement to repress the diatessaron of Tatian and get Syriac Christians to use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bring it in conformity with the rest of the Christian world. He succeeded so much, he succeeded too much. Now we don't have the Aramaic copy of the diatessaron anymore, so he's too zealous, and now it's disappeared. We do have an Arabic translation of it, so it's not totally disappeared. And we also have commentary on diatessaron by Ephraim the Syrian. Bar Hebraeus lived from 1226 to 1286. Abdul Faraj was his name. He was a son of a Jewish physician, hence Bar Hebraeus, which means the son of the Hebrew. He wrote extensively in Syriac. You also have Michael the Syrian, 1126 to 1199. He wrote an important chronicle. So there are other church fathers and theologians throughout history in the Syriac tradition, but this is a general introduction. Now I want to talk about some important books that are in Syriac that I think are probably the most important. The Odes of Solomon. The Odes of Solomon is an Aramaic Christian hymn book, and it's very ancient. Some people believe that it dates as early as the year 70 A.D. Some people date it to a little later period, maybe as late as 130. So we don't know how old it is, but it's very ancient, and it's an amazing thing if it is from 70 A.D., so that means it was written when many of the apostles were still alive and before the New Testament was finished. So that makes it very important. It's a hymn book, and recently someone was trying to put some of the hymns in the Odes of Solomon into modern music. So the Odes of Solomon is a hymn book used by the early church, perhaps as old as the 1st century. The Doctrine of Addai tells the story of the Assyrian Church of the East, or actually just the Syriac churches as a whole. It's the story of Thaddeus, one of the apostles of Jesus, and how he took the gospel to Mesopotamia. The Acts of Thomas tells the story of St. Thomas in India. The Book of the Himyarites tells the story of massacres of Christians by a Jewish leader of Arab tribes during the pre-Islamic period. The Book of the Tower tells the story of the conversion of the Mongolian Kiryat tribe to the Assyrian Church of the East. The Book of Protection is an Assyrian book of prayers and blessings, verging on magic, I guess, but it's basically a prayer book for protection against evil forces. The Jesus Sutras is a name given to the writings in Chinese by Assyrian Christians. Another interesting book is the history of Maryabala and Barsuma the Mongol. This is an interesting story about a reverse Marco Polo. Marco Polo traveled from Venice, of course, to the Mongolian Empire, and he wrote about his experiences, and he mentions a lot of so-called Nestorian and Jacobite churches. Pretty much everywhere he went, he found Aramaic churches. But Rabban Barsoma and Mark, who became the patriarch of the Assyrian church, they were from the area around Beijing. And the story is they were going on a pilgrimage to China, and they got caught up in the affairs of the state of the Mongolian Empire. And Mark became the patriarch of the Church of the East, and Barsuma was like a reverse Marco Polo. He's a Chinese Assyrian Christian, or a Chinese member of the Church of the East, an Nestorian, and he traveled to Europe trying to get the Europeans to join the Mongols in a crusade to destroy Islam. It didn't pan out, unfortunately, but he wrote a book of his experience, so it's really fascinating to see this perspective of a Chinese person traveling in Europe, appearing before the heads of state and the leaders of the Catholic Church. I think he went to Rome and he did the liturgy of Mar Mari and Mar Addai. So this is some information about how to study the scriptures from an Aramaic perspective, and these are some of the resources that are available, and a little information about the Syriac traditions, so you get a little bit of a bigger picture. Like I mentioned, I got a copy of Ephraim's commentary on the Diatessaron. You should be able to get the Doctrine of Addai, the story of Thaddeus converting King Abgar. So some of these writings are accessible, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Like I said, the Syriac Peshitta exists in English translation. A lot of these things do exist in English translation, but not everything yet. There's a lot of research that needs to be done in the field of Syriac studies. So I hope you can join us next time. I hope you learned a lot from this program. And the next episode is about the origins of the Christians in the East. So glad you took time to watch this program. I hope you learned a lot. And join us for the next episode. And I pray that God would bless you and help you to grow in the Lord.
Research, rescue, and restore. Help Voice of the Word and Aramaic Christian Ministries mission research the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times of the Bible. rescue persecuted Assyrian Christians in the Middle East, and restore Christianity to its original Semitic roots. For Stephen Missick's books, online giving, and other resources from Aramaic Christian Ministries, visit www.stephenmissick.com. Join us next time on Voice of the Word as we research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots.